not being very flattering about Obama and his Afghanistan policy. Now, they say he might not really be paying the consequences of it in American domestic politics, where pulling out of Afghanistan, as he's announced he'll do by summer 2013, remains popular. But what exactly is he leaving behind? They say the idea put forward by Obama and Karzai at the end of this NATO conference was a kind of joint hallucination. The idea that a more democratic and fairer Afghanistan can be made with Karzai, who they describe as corrupt and weak, at the top of it is impossible. We're fooling ourselves if we think anything better can be made out of the situation in this country than there is now. And if we think we can deal with the Taliban as if they had changed over the last 10 years of conflict, we're also deceiving ourselves. Of course, a key part of the US strategy, which has failed so far, but we expect them to try and attempt again, is indeed talking to the Taliban and trying to bring about some kind of political agreement, something most observers agree is necessary. But foreign policy say, come on, they haven't changed in any way, and the Obama policy, first pushing a surge, then pulling the troops out, has been totally incompetent in their judgment. The Washington Post is not all that much more complimentary. We can't ignore, they say, the Taliban have been strengthened in the end by 10 years of conflict, but they remain important players. We're going to have to talk to them and broker some kind of agreement. Otherwise, we can't expect there to be any kind of peace in Afghanistan after the US troops pull out. But they, of course, are not the only ethnic group in the country either. There's numerous others that also will need to be allowed to feel that they're part of the political process. The Independent, for its part, has been in Afghanistan looking at the fruits of a scheme on the ground that paid former Taliban militants to leave fighting and either join the Afghan security forces or become cereal farmers. They paid them $120 a month for 3 months to hand in their weapons, and it's been mooted as an extremely successful scheme. But what's going to happen once the foreign troops pull out? Will they just go back to fighting for the Taliban or farming opium poppies? It's hard to say.
Talked a bit about Egypt in the news bulletin, of course, here on France 24 today. Elections tomorrow, Wednesday. What are the press making of the candidates?
Well, for the New York Times, what's really important is the role that's going to be played by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the Egyptian army that's currently in control. Lots of people worried they're going to want to hang on to power through the proxy of whichever presidential candidate wins. The NYT's analyst doesn't reckon that will happen, but they say that they still want to preserve their influence. Of course, what they don't want to see is military members being chased up after by the new government and being punished for having repressed demonstrators during recent months. Now, to avoid that, they're going to want to try and pull strings behind the scenes. Now, for the Egypt Independent, they've got an article written by a famous Egyptian novelist which says that just thinking about the presidential candidates made him have horrible nightmares about being eaten by rats. So there's not a very flattering analogy in that article. But he says that for secularists like him, there are no good options. It's like Egypt is playing a game of Russian roulette. None of the candidates that are really in with a serious chance of winning represent the young people who took to the streets and pushed Mubarak out. They're either conservative Islamists or they're conservative former Mubarak cronies, as he puts it. No other candidate really has enough money to be able to run a winning campaign.
Staying in the Middle East, Syrian conflict leaching into Lebanon.
Yes, the National today, looking at why that is in their editorial, they say effectively that it's because of the failure of Kofi Annan's UN plan. They say that helped legitimise the Assad regime in the eyes of the opponents, making them more radicalised and more inclined to violence. It also means the Assad regime feel that they have a cover for their own violence. That paper's cartoon has got Syria and Lebanon in patients in adjacent beds, catching from one another a contagious disease. And over in Lebanon itself, the French-language paper L'Orient Le Jour says that the fact that violence has now spread to Lebanon is like a present for Bashar al-Assad. The more chaos there is in the region, the happier he'll be.
And finally, South African President Jacob Zuma, story involving him suing a Johannesburg art gallery.
Yes, this is because they displayed a nude portrait of him, which he says is an attack on the dignity of his office. Sadly, the photo we don't have there, but it's slightly
probably
rude,
good.
Actually, this particular photo. Now, this has become, the Guardian says, it's gone from being a story about one small art gallery that very few South Africans would normally visit to being a big national debate about freedom of speech and whether or not the president should be able to stop them displaying this unflattering nude portrait of him.
Perhaps we'd have to censor it. Elena, thanks very much. Elena Casas with the international papers, of course, here on France 24. Headlines then, winding down. NATO agrees to a timetable to pull out its troops from Afghanistan, but no peace with Pakistan after a row over supply routes. Yemen's military cancels a parade planned for later today to mark the reunification of the country. It's after nearly 100 soldiers killed in a massive suicide attack yesterday. And fears over stability in Mali as the country's caretaker president is dragged from his home and beaten up as soldiers watched on. Still to come then, Two's company, Qantas, splits itself in half to try to find safety in numbers. That's in the business news. That'll be with you right after the break.